All right. Well, I'll get us started, and I'll keep sending out messages to the meetups with the
Okay.
link in case there's any mix-up. But I'll let us get going because I want to make sure Ray has time to cover what he wants to cover with everybody. So welcome everyone to our Agile Groupies and Daytona Devs December meetup. Happy December 1st to everyone. We have Ray Villalobos joining us. He is a LinkedIn instructor. He's joining us from Florida, and he's sharing with us some coding skills on JavaScript, Vue JavaScript, and animation. So thank you, Ray. I'm going to just turn it over to you and take us away.
Super.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to share a window here that I have on my screen. Let's see. And hopefully you guys can see that. It looks like a slide, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm talking about today is Vue.js, happens to be version 3, and it's from a course that I did called Vue.js 3 Essential Training. It actually hasn't quite published yet. It's still in our editing process. So the 3rd version of Vue.js is still, I think it's still in, I don't know, Golden Master, or it's really released, but not everything is quite perfect right now. So to get to these slides, you can go to this URL, rabo.org/slides_Vue3, and it'll show you this screen. And I'm going to show you first how to work with this, and then I'm going to be going over Vue.js. I'm not assuming that everybody knows what that is or knows how to work with it. So I'm going to go do an introduction of the different parts of Vue.js, and then I'm going to talk about some of the animation features that it comes with and how it makes it a lot easier to actually animate things by creating some special classes for you. So the way that you work with this slideshow is you can see that you can use the arrows to move forward and back through the different slides. This particular slide doesn't have any other pieces to it. If you want to get rid of that little toolbar at the bottom, you can hit the T key, and that toolbar has the link to the slides. It's a link to the GitHub repo that I'll be using for this course, link to my courses, link to my blog, and then my contact info at LinkedIn and GitHub. If you hit the M key, so you'll get this sidebar, and the sidebar has essentially a list of every video that will be on that course. We don't have this course yet. So you can jump to any of the slides, and I'll be jumping through some of these. And then if you hit this notes link in this sidebar menu, you'll be taken to essentially like a little website that has all my notes for the project. So this is the notes that if I was recording a video for the course, that I would be reading from. So this is great. You don't have to take any notes. They're all in here for you already. You can just sit back, relax, and listen to me, play the video back later. There's a lot of opportunities for exercises here. So if you want to go back to the slides, then you can click back on any of these icons to the right. So the first slide that I'll talk about is how to install Vue.js. Actually, let's see. Yeah. So, and let me pull up on my screen the notes so that I know what I'm talking about. All right. So Vue.js is essentially a progressive framework that lets you build sites in a way that is a lot easier. One of the features that it has that is what I would call the killer app feature is, first of all, it's progressiveness. So unlike other tools, like say Angular, the competitors to Vue.js would be like Angular and React. The difference between those and Vue.js is first, it's progressive nature, which means that you can install Vue.js by using just a script tag, just like if you would with jQuery. So you don't have to commit to having a build process and running a number of tools to just get it working. You can literally, just like you would with jQuery, install the script tag, and the project would be available to you on any web page. So it actually works really well with an existing project that you have. You just want to throw Vue.js in there for some additional features, you can throw it up in there. You can also work with a regular build process. So there's actually 2 APIs in Vue.js. So you could just, if you want to incorporate it into an existing project, all you need to do is copy this script tag, just like you would jQuery or just like you would Bootstrap or anything else. And then the project becomes available. So this particular version is the 3rd version. So you have to use this @next feature, but you can also install any version that you want in here. Or if you want to use the more complicated, if you're building an entire app with Vue.js, you can still use npm to install the application like you would a normal project. Now, Vue.js also has an official CLI, which is a terminal tool that allows you to automate the build process, make it a lot simpler. So if you, one of the nice things about Vue.js is that, honestly, I think it has the best CLI of any of the tools. So if you use Angular, if you use React, I think that they have the absolute best CLI. They have 2 versions of it. You can use the Vue create and then the name of the project that you want to create, or it also has a GUI tool. If you're more into like GUI tools, you can just launch Vue UI and it will walk you through an installation for you. So npm install first to install the CLI, and then you can create a project with the terminal by just issuing a Vue create command. This is if you don't want to use the script tag, or you can use Vue UI and it walks you through installing everything. And it's, like I said, honestly, it's the most beautiful CLI that I've ever seen. There's also, if you're going to be working with Vue.js, you also want to install some of the developer tools that are available for different platforms. So you can get the developer tools for Chrome, Firefox, or Electron, which is how you would build desktop apps if you wanted to use Vue.js for that. So if you want to take a look at what a project would look like, you can click on this link right here. And this is how you would just use the script tag. So here, how we're going to be working in our project is we're going to install Bootstrap. I'm using 5 Alpha 2, just because I like to complicate my life and work with lots of alphas. But I'm installing Bootstrap as well as Font Awesome for some icons. And then I'm installing Vue.js just using the script tag right here. And that will allow me to work with the simple version of the library. What does this exercises link do? Okay, so I also have created a CodePen project for most of the things that we'll be working on. And this CodePen project essentially does the same thing. So if we go to CodePen and hit settings, then if we go to HTML, you'll see that I'll go to JS first. So I'm installing Vue.js. I'm not installing the JavaScript part of Bootstrap, but I am installing the CSS part of Bootstrap right here. And I've also created a container with a little bit of margin at the top in Bootstrap. So this means that I can now use Vue.js in CodePen. So you'll see that I've created some examples for you guys to practice with and play around with if you want to try things out. Traditionally, with Vue.js, you create a div with an ID, and your application essentially runs inside this div. So you can have a normal web page, you can create some sort of like normal website, and your application would display in this div, but you would still be able to see the rest of your content. So it plays really well with any other website that you have installed at the moment. So let me go over to the next slide. So this will be basic setup, so you can get an idea of the basics of how it works. So as I mentioned, you create a template section in your HTML. That template section has an ID or some sort of identifier. It doesn't have to be an ID, it can be a class, although that would be confusing if you plan to have more than one of them. So you usually give it an ID, and then inside that div, you have full access to Vue.js templates. In this case, we're using an expression, and that expression is outputting a variable. So it looks like, although this looks like HTML, this is actually written in the Vue language. Vue.js is going to take over your div and replace it with the results of your application, wherever that div happens to be. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 2 APIs for working with Vue.js. The global API is what we're going to be using when you work with the script tag, and there's a slightly different application API when you're working with applications. For this sort of session, we're just going to be working with the global API. The application API is a lot more complex, so we're not going to be doing that. So this is how you initialize an application in Vue.js. This is what would happen in your script tag. you would use the Vue object once you import that script, and then you use the create app method. And into that method, you can pass along an object. The object is kind of like a configuration object. So in that object, you can create a data section. This allows you to define the state of your application. Essentially, that just means you can put up a bunch of variables in this data section by returning them, and then those variables will be accessible in your Vue.js project. Once you create the application, then you can use this mount method to load that application into an element in your HTML. So you're loading this into an item that has an ID of app right here, which you saw earlier, right? Let's see. All right, so you can also do it as a separate app object. So you can also create and you'll see this often, you'll create a variable for your application, then you'll just put all that code for creating the Vue.js application there, and then you will kind of call create app separately, loading up that application. So you'll see Vue.js used in both ways. I think this is probably the more traditional way that you will see Vue.js installed. All right, so the features that Vue.js has that are interesting and that are what I call the killer app features for Vue.js are declarative rendering, which means that you essentially are writing something that looks like HTML, but in reality, you're using a language that allows you to use the features, and you're going to add a bunch of directives. So directives are commands that you want to add to your HTML that will let it perform additional functions. So this extends the capabilities of HTML. Those commands are going to be converted or rendered into code that the browser will display. So you're going to be writing things in a language that's slightly different than HTML. Another feature that it has is text interpolation. You saw a little bit of it. The double curly braces allow you to output your parts of your variables that you have stored in the application. Sometimes those are called mustaches because they're double curly braces and they kind of look like sideways mustaches. So inside you can actually put more than just variables. They can also be expressions. So you can make concatenations, any kind of JavaScript expressions. One thing that's not obvious from the example that we've seen is that the data that you define in Vue.js is reactive. This is the killer feature of Vue.js, and also if you look at Angular, the killer feature is that your data is reactive, which means that if something causes the data to change, the DOM is automatically updated for you. So the thing that happens in your brain when you're working with something like Vue is that you're not thinking about the DOM at all. So if you work with JavaScript, you know that if you make a change to data, you have to go in and push that data into the DOM and delete items from the DOM and add items to the DOM. Vue.js takes all care of that for you. So all you're worrying about when you're developing with Vue is how is my data changing based on the interactions from people using it. So that is really one of the reasons why people go to something like React, and Vue.js is almost exactly like React. I think the differences between the two, if you come from a React world, is that React has this language called JSX, which is like a combination of HTML and JavaScript. I find it just a bit annoying because when you write HTML in JSX, you have to remember that you can use the keyword class, for example. You have to use, if you want to define a CSS class, you have to change that to class name because class in JavaScript means something. Vue.js feels more natural to write, so you'll pick it up immediately. All right, so here at the end of every one of these slides, there's a section where I have a problem and a solution. And essentially, the problem set is sort of a set of tasks that I want you to perform, and you can try following along with me as I do this one. So the problem is how I set things up. The solution is what it looks like at the end. And then this div is actually a link to GitHub where it shows you what you need to change between those two slides. So it's kind of a cheat sheet, and I'm going to use this because I need to know what I need to type so I don't mess it up, because live demos, right? If we take a look at the problem, what I've done here is set up a sample Vue.js project in CodePen. And again, you can follow along with me. This has an application in it, and we're using Vue to create an application and mount it into an element that has an ID of app, which is right here. So it's kind of puts together what we have, what I've shown you before. So notice that when I am calling this application, I can now use, with the double curly braces, I can use my expression to output something that is in the data of my application. So if you wanted to create a separate application, you would just issue a div right here, and I'm going to give it an ID of another app, right? And this will just create a div for new application to live in. I'm also going to do an H1 here, and I will output some sort of data that I'm going to call name. So what I'll show you here is that you can actually have multiple Vue applications in the same HTML page. I'll just use a Vue create app method here. And this time, unlike creating the variable that I've done here, I'm just going to pass the object directly, like I've shown you that you can also do. So you create a data section, and there's a lot of other sections that you can put in here. And then you have to use a return statement, pass in an object, and you would output polo shirt here, right? And this would, sorry, somebody's trying to text me on the other section. So now I need to mount this application. So I'm going to say mount this into the element with an ID of another app, right? And so what that would do is now it outputs the variable that I have here into my new application. So this is pretty cool. You know, once you install that Vue script, you actually can install as many instances of Vue.js as you want. And these are the two ways of doing it. So try that out. It's pretty cool. And like I said, there's a lot of powerful things happening here. And just remember that everything inside the div is a template that gives you full access to all of the Vue.js features. So let's close that out. Let's go over to the next one. So let's show you how data binding works. So directives in Vue.js are another word for commands. When you are using regular HTML tags like the image tag, your first sort of way to try to create a dynamic image section is maybe to use expressions here, but expressions don't work inside HTML statements. And so what you have to do is use a directive to have access to the data here. So that image source, so you might try, okay, well, I'm just going to dynamically put in image source here, and that should work. That doesn't work. What you actually need to do is call up a directive, and the directive that we use whenever we want to create a dynamic tag that reads data from a variable, then we use this vbind directive. So vbind means I want you to look for a variable called image source and put that in here, right? And you could do the same thing for this alt tag. You could type in, if you wanted to, vbind. So essentially bind this data to a variable, right? So you could say vbind and then colon, and then the alt tag will have other variable here, right? So it's the format is like this: vbind and then some sort of ID. Notice that here we use alt, here we use source. Almost every HTML tag that you would use would have a vbind version of it that is just written like that. Let's see. There's actually a shortcut, and you'll never see the vbind because the shortcut is just the colon. So you will almost never see vbind actually used in the wild. You will always see the colon because it's just easier to remember. So again, I could do colon alt here, right? And I could say other var here, and it would output whatever was in some other variable there as well. So the directives always have a v dash prefix. There's a lot of them. You'll see some of them in just a minute. They usually take arguments, and they can be more than just references to variables. They can actually contain simple JavaScript expressions in them. So concatenate, whatever else you want. They also set up a reactive binding relationship. As I mentioned, if something causes your image link to change for some reason, the DOM will automatically be taking care of you as it happens dynamically. And again, that's the killer sort of feature of Vue.js. So if we take a look, you can take a look at the docs for more information. There's always a link to like all the documentation from these slides as well. And so if we take a look at the sort of problem that I set up for you here, it's going to be, the problem is we have this slightly expanded bunch of data with a name, description, image source, and price. And you can see that using, you know, expressions, I have actually output everything except for the image here. The image source tag is right here. And so if I wanted to add an image, say underneath my headline level 2, I would add an image tag here. And I would say, because I'm not using regular HTML, I'm going to use the vbind directive. Again, I could use vbind, but nobody does that. You just use the colon and then source, and you could just say, okay, I want you to use img source, the variable, and then it would just output that image in there for you. That looks funky, so I'm going to add a bootstrap class of image fluid here, right? And that'll just make it fit. And then in the same way, if I wanted the alt tag to properly have the name of the item, then I would just switch it to a vbind directive and type in name right here. And although you can't see it, it's there. But that's as simple as it is. You just have to remember, for just outputting variables, you use expressions. For modifying existing tags, you use directives, which start with vbind, or just a shortcut, which is a colon. So pretty cool. And I didn't go over these, but you can take a look at them and just look at the solution diff or the problem. Okay, so let's see, that was data binding. So one of the things that is really common when working with projects is going over a list of things. And this is where I think Vue.js really shines. When you're working with lists, there is a directive or a command called v-for. Again, it's the way that you loop in the template. So you essentially create something like this. You say v-for, and you create a local variable, and you reference some sort of array element. So if you have a bunch of data that appears in my elements, then you can say create a temporary variable called my item, and then output each one of those items names. So it's going to loop through my elements, and then output each one of the my name variables that are present for each one of the elements. So you can also, this is pretty cool. It's a very flexible directive. You can actually just ask for a number of items. So you could say just output something 10 times. That's what this means. So you have a variable that you want to do, and this would be good for if you're setting up, I don't know, some templates somewhere. You could actually just output something a number of times. You can also use, instead of in, you can use of. This is more like what regular JavaScript would use, the of keyword instead of the in. So this is exactly the same as the other one. Most of the time, I think, since Vue.js is in version 3, most people you would use in. You can also get an index. So if you write it like this, just like with regular JavaScript, you can get an index, and then you can use the index in your output as well. Let's see. You can also provide a key, and a key is really important in Vue.js. Some things that you do in Vue.js require that you have a key associated with them. So the way that you create a key is just by passing along a vbind directive with key, and then you specify some sort of unique ID for each element. And sometimes this is required in things that you do. The last way of using the v-for directive is to loop through different elements. So you can actually loop through an object. If you're not using an array, if you're using an object, you can just loop through each one of the elements. And in that, you'll have access to the index, the key, as well as the value for the object. So just different ways in that you can use that. All right, so one of the things that happens when you're using v-for is that sometimes you want to output the container tag that has the loop, and sometimes you don't. So if you're rendering a list with an unordered list and list items, you definitely want to render this UL, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you want to just render the items without the container tag. So Vue.js uses a special tag called template. And in this case, you will be looping through these elements, but this template tag would never show up in your HTML, in your rendered HTML. So you would just get a number of span tags with whatever the data was that was in my object or my elements, right, in the list. So, right, so there's a number of, I'm not going to go over these, but there's a number of mutation detections that you can add. So you can modify v-for, you know, and it does fully support mutation methods, which lets you modify arrays. So you can do like a pop, push on different elements as you go through them. So I'm not going to go over those, but totally do that. You also have the ability to filter and concat. So in advanced applications, these things are pretty useful. So it supports all those, and it has its own version, because remember, Vue.js is not just pushing or popping or filtering or slicing. It's actually creating DOM management for you. So these things require its own ability to process these kind of mutation or replacement methods. And you can learn more about it in the docs. So for this one, let's see, we have, you know, I give you some ideas for examples of what to do here. So just getting used to v-for. So let's just go to, I'm going to pull up the diff here, and I'm going to go to the solution first here. So essentially what I'm doing here is looping through a list of items, and I have used the v-for directive with an index in this case using this key. So there's now 3 items in my products list here. It's an array, and they do have an ID. So I'm using the ID here, right? And I'm looping through each one of the elements, just like we did before, using expressions, as well as using the vbind directive to bind things like this image location. Notice that here I'm using actually an expression. So where I'm outputting the name, as you know, arrays are 0 indexed. So just to show you that you can actually use an expression, not just a call to a variable, but a simple expression will work here as well. And I think I could type that, but it would probably be somewhat boring. So let me move on. So what is next? Let's see, you're entering lists. All right, so we have traditional conditional statements in Vue.js as well. So you have a family of statements that you can use in your templates, like vif, velse, velsif. I think every one of these, except for maybe vshow, are pretty self-explanatory. So you can test to see if a condition is met, a truthy condition is met, by using the vif statement. And so what this will do is, if this variable happens to have a true value or a truthy value, how we say in JavaScript, then this div would show up, right? If it doesn't have, if this has a false value, then you wouldn't even, this div would not even render into your document. And if something changes this value dynamically, then Vue.js will actually manage the toggling of that element automatically for you, which is pretty magical. And you'll see that in a minute. So you can also, of course, use else statements with velse. If the value is true, then it shows the first one. If it's false, it shows the second one. You can also have, of course, velse if you want to test out different values, and this is how that would work. All right, you can also, of course, hide containers using templates. And so if you wanted to not output the container div, then you would just use the template with your vif statements. Okay, let's see. So that vshow, vshow, I think it's like a slightly older directive, and it's essentially the same as vif with a couple of differences. So vshow will only hide the display property. So if you use vshow and this happens to be false, it would still render this div, but it would be just hidden and you wouldn't be able to see it. but it would still be there. So this is good for if you're toggling things. The other thing is that you can't use this with a template tag. So if you wanted to do template, you can't do that with the show. And I think it's just an slightly older directive, so you won't really see it used a lot. I think that if you do have complex items that need to be toggled on and off, technically vShow would be faster because it's in the HTML, it's just not showing it to you. So we just have to change the display property as opposed to rendering the whole thing. So some people find it useful. And again, maybe you would see it in other examples. You can also, you also should not use VF inside of V4, and that's a little bit because of the DOM management and the way that Vue.js works and takes care of things for you. So you really shouldn't do this kind of thing. Do a for statement with a VIF, and this is because VIF has a slightly higher priority than V4. So in this first example, like the VIF statement would not have access to this variable because it sort of tries to perform this before this V4 is available in my alias. So my alias's variable wouldn't be available when you were testing out the statement. So in order to write something like this, you would use the template tag, put the V4 in the template, and then you could do the VIF inside that. So used to throw a big old error when you used to do that. So here, what I've set up is just a way for you to test out, let's see, the problem. And again, I don't think you can try following it along. But what I've done here in the solution is essentially go over and add these different tags depending on the value of the price of each item. So you can see what I've done here is just created some VIF statements. If the price is greater than 90, then show this tag. If it's between 90 and 10 to 90, then show this, and otherwise show this one. So that's really the whole exercise that you saw. And we have this V4, and we're using a template here to not output, you know, any tag here. Because, you know, one thing I hate is when you have like way too many containers in your code. And so this kind of eliminates the need for an extra container. So pretty cool. All right, let's see, where am I? There's all kinds of other things, but I wanted to kind of start jumping into the animation features. So we're going to jump through a ton of stuff here and go over to transitions. So in Vue.js, you can add classes to items in all kinds of different ways, and there's some sessions or some lessons before on how to add the classes. But one of the features that it gives you is this special transition tag, which makes it much easier to animate things. So the way that it works is you create a transition tag and you pass along a name, and this is optional. You can actually just create a transition tag and then just put stuff in here, right? Whatever you want in here would be something that would display an animation. And the transition tag is going to, if you have a name parameter, it's going to generate some classes for you automatically and insert them in the life cycle of the animation. So again, you're probably going to want to see this, but essentially Vue.js is going to inject classes as things are happening in your application. So more as we see an example. So it's going to create them for you and then trigger when the animations happen. As things are starting to appear, it'll create these classes temporarily and delete them for you. So you have all these classes that it will automatically create for you, like enter and leave classes. And if you give it, if you create a tag with a name parameter, like we had before here, then so say that you call this Bob or something, right? Then when it generates these classes for you, the classes would actually be named Bob enter from, Bob interactive, Bob enter to, right? So if you don't include a name, then it'll just use V- as the default prefix. And then in here, you have different triggers for what the application is doing at the moment that it is trying to transition. So for example, the two events that you're interested in when animating are when the items that you're animating are entering the scene and when they are leaving the scene, right? And so you have these triggers that let you capture those instances. And then you have the from and to triggers. The from option lets you set up what happens like before the animation begins, like what the position of the object is, and the to would let you choose what you're animating to. So if you're familiar with animations, those are kind of the keyframes that it sets up automatically for you. And then the active state lets you control how that animation is going to play. So this is where you would set up any kind of easing curves that you would want to for your animation. Again, this makes a lot more sense with an example. There's no good way of explaining this. I'll show you how this works. So I have this button, I click on it and it plays an animation. And if I click it again, it plays a different animation. So the way that if I hit it again, it'll just do that again and over, right? So how do we set this up? By creating this transition section right here with a headline level 2, which this is actually the thing that animates over here is this headline. We have this button up here with some bootstrap classes, and it's gonna, this has a variable that a Boolean, right, that we have in an if statement. Otherwise, you might be able to see the words when this first loads. So this is saying just only display it if the show me variable is true. And then the button itself has, this is how you do events. You can say the @ and then the event that you want to target. You can say when somebody clicks on this button, execute. Actually, you can call a method here, but in here, we're just saying toggle the value of this variable from true to false. So, when this first loads, the variable is going to be set to false. You can see that right here. So this variable is set to false when this animation, this page first loads. And then when I click on it the first time here, it'll be set to true. And then when I click on it again, it'll be set to false and the animation will go on. So how is it doing that? Well, all that is happening because we defined this as a transition element. And then in my CSS, I created a number of classes telling it what it does at each one of those states. So I say where is it going to enter from? What's the position of the element when it's beginning to appear, right? And what the active class allows me to set up the speed of the transition, the animation speed and the easing. And then, I can set up the state of the opacity also at the beginning and at the end. So that's really all that's happening here. And if we were to look at this code, so I want to show you, let me click on this go button and inspect that element right here. I want you to pay close attention to what's happening in this section when I click on the button. Notice that the classes are being automatically added. I don't know if you can see it really quick, but you can see that there, at some point, it generates the vleave from and vleave to. They happen very quickly, but you can see that it's adding and deleting classes as things are happening with my project. So as those classes start appearing, it's the CSS that I've written here takes over and does all of the actual animation. So by generating these classes for you, it gives you the ability of creating these really cool animations by having access to all those injection classes as you work with your project. So I think that's pretty awesome. If you don't want to create your own classes and you want to use a different framework, then it also gives you, hold on, sometimes to go through these. That's okay. So you can also use existing classes by naming them. So if you're using a class from a framework, then you can say, go ahead and display the class. And again, I think this is better shown than talked about. So for example, the example that I'm going to show you uses a library called Animate.css. So weirdly enough, that URL is not Animate.css, but Animate.style. So don't get confused that the name and the URL are different. And this has a bunch of different built-in animation classes that you can just try out, right? None of these are particularly interesting. Okay, so if you want to use an existing library, then you can use these properties to, activate those classes when the different events happen. So it's the same thing as before, except that now we can use some pre-made classes in our application. So if I try it here, you can see that if I click on this, you get a little bit sort of more interesting animation, but I have no CSS, so I didn't have to create all those myself. Those were already made, and all I'm doing is saying, okay, when something starts entering the screen, then use animate.css and use one of the animations, and whenever it's leaving, then use this other animation. So it makes it, if you have an existing framework that has all the transitions, it makes it a little bit easier to work with, right? Same thing, show me variable starts off as false here. So good stuff. All right, so there's also, you can create your own classes. You can use existing classes from a framework like Animate.css, or you can do the whole thing through JavaScript if you wanted to do things with JavaScript. So there are events that will happen that you can target. So you can say when something is entering, execute this piece of code, and it will take care of doing whatever is in that code for you. So that's how you would, this is how you would use it. You use the transition tag, and then you would say, I want to use the specific hook. So you would say before enter here. And then when that, when that starts to happen before the element is inserted, I want you to execute some method or do some JavaScript in this section, which is pretty cool. Let's, so then the method that you're calling can just do whatever you want it to in here. So let's take a look at an example of that. Come on, so I'm gonna try it. Same go button, but you can see here, I'm gonna hit this go button, and what it's actually, so the animation is working just like it did in the previous example. It's still using animate.css. What is different is that I now have all these additional methods that modify the color of my button as when I click on it. So when I click the button, you'll notice that it'll start by turning to yellow, and then when the animation is done, it'll turn green with that highlight, and then if I click on it again, it'll turn yellow, and then once the animation is done, it'll turn back to gray. So the way that I'm doing that is by capturing all those different methods, and you can do whatever you want in here, but this is a simple example. So what I'm doing is modifying the class for each one of the buttons here to whatever color I want it to be. So that makes it easy to capture the events in JavaScript and then perform different methods as the events are taking place, as they're getting triggered. So that is pretty cool, I think, anyways. All right, so I'm show you the solution. Let's take a look at the time, 12:47. So I'll show you the solution so you can see how this is in practice. So what I have here is a set of products. So this is actually, if you hit this change view and go add the editor view here in CodePen, you'll see that I have a number of items, and I have this little slider, and in I'm actually reading. So this is a way more complicated example. So this is how you read data from a database. So in this case, from an API. So Vue.js has these sort of lifecycle hooks. So you can say when my application is first created, then go get something from an API, and then stick all that into the products variable, which used to have a bunch of stuff in it before. But in this case, I'm just reading it through an API. And then what I'm doing here is creating an animation that happens depending on the value of this maximum price. So the items are sort of sliding to the left, or from the right into position depending on the value here. And I did that by using this transition here, and then capturing the different events in here in my methods section. I'm modifying, actually, I think I'm modifying how those are sliding in and out. So, all right, let's see. A couple of other advanced things that you can do is you can sort of work in a slightly different way when you have lists of items. So we saw a list of items, but this is a little bit different. You can add an appear property, and you actually don't need this part right here. And with this appear property, you can choose to have an animation when the element first appears on screen. So the way that that works, actually, and there's also a way, these are actually some advanced features, some of the advanced features. You can also specify how you want the animation to switch from between two different pieces. So if you, let me show you this transition here. So here is how, if you wanted to have two items, so here I have two buttons, and I wanted to animate between them, then you can create a transition. And I think if I refresh this page, so I'm just gonna add a space here so that it causes a refresh. You'll see that this, it actually plays a little animation when it begins. See that little kind of zoom in? That's happening because I added this appear keyword to my transition. If I take that off, the object will just show up whenever it refreshes. You don't even see any different. But if I hit appear, then it'll use some of my CSS classes to animate this one. And by using this mode, I can control the order in which these two buttons are showing. So if I click on this one button, it'll play the zoom out animation for the first button, and then it'll play the next button. And so one of the advanced features is that you can modify, instead of out in, you can say in out. And most of the time you want out in, because in this case, it'll actually start showing the next animation before it gets rid of this one. So this is a slightly different animation, but it lets you control the order in which two animations that are in a transition will appear. So advanced feature number one. It also has some advanced features. So you can, there's a lot of properties that you can add to animations, like duration, for example, how long a transition will happen. And then whether or not you want to pay attention to any other CSS that you have on your page inside the transitions. And you can also create a transition group. So let me just show you this. So notice that the animation is now playing in sequence. I don't know if you saw that. The appear transition is actually happening so that you can stagger the transitions that happen in order. So these transition groups will allow you to take a list and kind of display them with a different animation. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a delay for each of the items as they play by using a little bit of the after enter event, and then adding some a different delay to each one of the elements. So you can target each individual item and it causes that to appear like that. There's a really weird advanced feature that I'm not sure that I will ever use, but it's sort of cool. And it's this way that you can actually shuffle elements as in lists as they animate using this vmove directive. I'm sorry, and I'm just going to show it to you because it's pretty cool. But I don't know, I guess if you have lists of things and you want to animate them. So what this is doing is adding a vmove class. So there's actually a couple of classes that you get when you have lists of items and transition groups. And if I click on this, you'll notice that it's randomizing the order of the items. So this shuffle method is what is just taking the array and randomizing the order of the elements in the array. And by just adding this vmove class, it's going to automatically do that animation where it moves the elements around. Sort of weird. I don't know why I would use it, but it's there for you. There's a lot of other advanced things that you can do with Vue.js animations, and I'll show you something in the docs. So in the transition, there is actually a way of tying in transitions that are based on data. So I think, I don't know if I can actually show you where the example is for this, but if you've ever seen an interface that draws things depending on values of different variables, then you would build it using all these transition methods that are built into Vue.js. So I feel like I'm out of time already, so I think I will stop and say thank you very much. Again, if you go to this URL, you can kind of go through all of the different lessons that I have and look at all the exercises. The notes that I typed in is pretty much what I say in my course, although there's a few things that are not written down because I have to just perform them, especially when I go to this problem solution part. I'm not sure when this course is going to be there, but I do have a number of other courses. So if you go here to courses, this is where all of my courses on LinkedIn are. And you can see that one of the projects that I did recently is how to build a Vue video chat app with Vue.js and Firebase. If you haven't used Firebase, it's the greatest database in the world. It's like a multi-user, real-time multi-user offline access database that it is almost as easy to use as Vue.js. You sort of set up your data, and if the application goes online, Firebase automatically takes care of offline for you. And then when it happens to connect again, it'll take care of updating things for you. You can have multiple users hitting the same data at the same time, and it will automatically update changes that the two users or more are doing at the same time. So if like a user deletes an element from a list, every other user that's connected will see it. Super cool. I built a video chat application there. And then I have a ton of other courses. So working with APIs on Vue.js. I have a lot of Vue stuff just because I love it. It's really my favorite framework. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I will stop sharing.
Great.
And I have more time, so I can hang around for questions if anybody wants to hang around. And
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Ray.
Hopefully.
Yeah, and would you put into the chat area the link to where your courses are?
Yeah, sure.
Because people, just so people know, if you in the chat window, you can save the chat, and that'll save it to your desktop, and then you can have the links there as well going forward. And as part of the recording, we will get a recording of everything in the chat room or the chat window as well. So that's great.
And you know, if you, I would suggest that you just go to, I'll put the link to the slide. So raybo.org slides view 3. And that's where the slides are. It has a link to everything. If you want to, you can, when that course releases, if you remind me, I can like unlock a course. And as long as you're following me on LinkedIn, and I think this has a link to my LinkedIn page under contact, LinkedIn, just click on the LinkedIn button. If you follow me and remind me, then I can unlock this course. And then I think you have like 30 days from the moment you click on the link to take it if you want to, but it's not released yet. So somebody remind me and I'll open it up for everyone who follows me on LinkedIn.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that offer. And so for folks, we can stay on for a few moments if people have questions. Before people leave, I did want to share, and I'm going to put in the chat window myself, our next event, which is we have on December 8th, which I believe is just next week, more focused in the Agile arena and organizing your personal and professional tasks and lives, especially now that we're all working from home. We call it our Agile at Home activity. So we're running that little workshop. It's an hour and a half next week. That's upcoming. So whether you're part of the Agile Groupies or Daytona devs or came to us through the Ann Arbor Tech Meetup, this is just another meetup that's available for all of you to attend. And we also have coming up in January, and let me just pull that event. We have a coach retreat coming up. It's something that we run every year. And I'm putting, it's an Eventbrite link right now in the chat window for that. And that's our annual coach retreat. We are, we've been running these now for a number of years, and it's started with being focused on Agile coaching, but really when you come right down to it, and kind of the things that you may be doing within your own teams, if you're helping other members learn something new or do something different, or begin to just change the way they work in any way, you are acting in a coaching role. And what we cover is just kind of the concepts of coaching. So it is a, a coach retreat for coaches to enhance their skills. So we've got this year people from the UK, from around the United States coming in and talking to us and providing us various techniques. So that's coming up in January. It's always the first weekend in January. This is January 9th, first weekend that's reasonable in January that we've scheduled it for. So those are things that are coming up for all of these meetup groups to keep us all engaged and active during a time when we're all kind of working from home. So thank you again to Ray for working with us and walking us through the animation aspects of Vue, the Vue piece of JavaScript. That was illuminating. It was great. We'll hang on for another few moments. If anyone has questions or so, then just speak up. Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump right in with questions. But thanks everyone for coming. If you need to go, respect your 1 hour time frame. So thanks for being with us, and we'll hope to catch you again.
Thanks, Helene. This was really great. I really enjoyed everything. Good job, Ray. Hi, Tom. And I look forward to the next one. Have a good day.
Great. Thanks. April.
Thanks, April. Super.
Thank you so much, Ray. That was a great presentation. I do have a question. I actually have a couple. I was wondering what are the big trade-offs between using a script, the script tag, versus like the application?
Yeah, so the application gives you a lot of advanced features. There's virtually nothing that you can do with the the app API that you can't do with the global API. But a few advanced things would be like routing. If you wanted to have like complicated routing, where so the app is really for building a complete app that it's where essentially Vue is running your entire application, versus the script API is really if you want to include parts of Vue.js on an existing page. The structure of everything is different. So you create separate files and they're single file components. So the way that you do things is completely different. If you are planning on building an entire app, then you use the app API. If you just want to include it, definitely, I guess, I don't know if loading time would be different because the apps would be much bigger, but it's just sort of different use cases. It's the only framework that currently, well, I mean, I'm not going to say the only framework, but out of the main frameworks, it's the only one that gives you that access to that script tag. So it's definitely a way to add all this templating power into an existing project without a lot of stress. So definitely, it's like so much easier to get into Vue because all you need is a script tag. Whereas like I remember Angular 1 used to have this thing called like the 5-minute install, and then they try to do it for when they really re-architected the application. They try to do a 5-minute install, but it was like 5 minutes as long as you did like half an hour worth of build processes and stuff. Sure. So I think the Vue, same thing happens with React. Like you can't just use React with a script tag. Right. So you get a ton of power. Clearly, you're just running another script on top of whatever else you're doing. But I think it's more of a use case scenario where if you're building an app, then you probably want to use the app API. If you just want to throw this up on an existing site, just use the script. And it works, I think, just as well, except that, some of the things like routing don't make a lot of sense. So routing will be if you wanted to have a single page application where when you clicked on different parts of the application, it actually kind of takes you to a separate quote unquote page. That would be not difficult, but it wouldn't make as much sense with just a script tag.
Yeah, no, I got it. That actually answers my second question. I was going to ask about routing. So
yeah. So there's a Vue.js router. It's in the course I do cover it. So if you go through those slides, there's a section in the application API, I think on chapter 5. And I go through, I love Vue, the CLI. I find it hard to believe that their CLI is better than the Angular and the React CLI, but it really is. And also when you start working with Vue, things will just make, I don't know if you have any experience with like React or Angular, but
Little bit.
everything just kind of makes sense. Yeah. Makes more sense with Vue. So yeah, the routing, it has a default router and some additional routers that you can plug in. And it's pretty simple, I think, to use. But yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks. Appreciate it.
Super. Yeah, man. What is your name?
Vaughn.
Is it Vaughn? Okay, yeah.
Yep.
I can't really tell. I can tell by your little speaker who's talking. So super.
Yeah, thanks again. And thanks, Helen, for putting this on. I appreciate it. It was a very good talk. So.
Great. I'm glad you guys could make it. All
Hey,
right.
you know, I did courses. I want to say I did courses on Angular, Vue, React, and even something called Svelte, which is a different idea. And at the beginning of my Vue courses, I always say, listen, hands down, by far, Vue is the one that I like the most. I'm honest about it. I've used all of them, but yeah, it's just there's something about it that makes it, I don't know, in my brain, it makes more sense immediately than the other ones. Sure. And the fact that it's truly open source, like React really belongs to Facebook, you know, whereas Vue is truly like an open source project.
Nice. Awesome. Well, all right, I got to run. So thank you so much.
Take care, man.
Thanks everyone for coming, and hope to catch you again next month. And again, thank you, Ray, for spending the time with us and walking us through the Vue animation. I really appreciate it. Maybe we'll do more. It clearly.
Yeah, maybe so.
All right, we'll be in touch. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye, everyone.